add value to your business, or do you want to just be this administrative person?
And often if you look at your talent team and the caliber of talent in your company, they correlate.
You could hire the best person for the job if they were in your candidate pool.
All these individual employees, one by one, together, their voices all come together to articulate the culture of the company.
I think in the recruiting world, bias is the biggest issue. And so getting that out of the system, first of all, is socially the right thing to do and morally, but it also massively expands your candidate pool.
Welcome back, family and friends, fans and bystanders. We are back live at HR Tech 2017. You can find us streaming at facebook.com/Entelo and stay tuned for a whole slew of goodness. Joining me on this fine morning is our very own founder and CEO here at Entelo, Jon Bischke. Jon, how's it going?
Hey, it's going well. The show is in full swing right now.
That's what we like to hear. So, who is joining us today, Jon?
Yeah, so I'm excited to be here with Laszlo Bock. Many of you know Laszlo from his work at Google, from the book that he wrote, and now more recently, he's the CEO and co-founder of Humu. And I'm excited to hear whatever he's going to share with us today about the company, but I think more importantly, his perspective on the space. So Laszlo, thank you for coming on board today. And why don't you give a little bit of background? Most people, I would guess, who listen to our podcast probably know of you, maybe have read your book, but give the 1-minute version for those who don't.
Sure, thanks. It's great to be here, Jon. So I joined Google in 2006. I left end of last year, and in that time I started as Google's first head of people operations and kind of built that organization responsible for culture, recruiting, a whole bunch of different areas, cafes at one point, so all the care and feeding. And then at the end of last year left and started, as you said, a company called Humu, which I can tell you very little about because we're very stealthy and sneaky. But
despite that, though, everybody wants to work for you. So apparently you've received thousands of applications despite nobody knowing what you do. What are people attracted to, do you think, about what you're working on?
Yeah, it's been wild. We were getting a resume a minute for the first week, which was crazy.
That's amazing.
But what people wrote in was they connected to the mission. The mission is, make work better everywhere through machine learning and science and a little bit of love. And that language, I think, really connected with people. Plus, I think the body of work my co-founder and I had building like systems at scale that do have that effect. But it's been pretty remarkable. We're still now looking for, a few great enterprise sales leads. Mm-hmm. So if anyone out there is an amazing enterprise sales leader, we'd be happy to chat.
Totally. Well, I think that the space, as you know very well, is a massive space, right? There are so many problems, interesting problems. There's so much to do that I clearly think you guys have identified something interesting. I want to ask a little bit about this concept of information asymmetry, right? You attribute that to this potential to solve or largely eliminate unemployment. Can you say more about that with, of course, not tipping your hand necessarily as to what you guys are doing as a business?
Yeah, I a few years ago wrote a LinkedIn post about this. My thinking was, part of what happens in the job search market is that there's huge information asymmetry between the job seeker and the employers. Information asymmetry basically just means there's a bunch of stuff I know as a candidate that the employer doesn't know, and there's a bunch of stuff the employer knows that the candidate, and that makes it really hard to match people and jobs. And even if you think about it within a company, a marketing analyst job in one part of a company is actually a different job than a marketing analyst job somewhere else. And so getting honed in on what those differences are is a huge opportunity.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, we think of fundamentally this being a matching challenge, right? And so much of that is simply more access for information. So as you think about the landscape now in the future, how do people become more informed about the decision? I mean, the decision of where you're going to work is as impactful on your life as probably anything other than maybe who you're going to get married to. How do people make more informed decisions? What does that look like?
Well, I think on the individual side, on the job seeker side, there's some emerging things. So you have sites like Glassdoor where people can publicly rate companies. You have products like Blind where people can confidentially talk about it. The problem with those is there's huge sample bias and not a lot of science behind being real specific, not just about what the company is like, but what that specific job is. So 10 years from now, it'll be a solved problem, but between now and then, there's an opportunity for companies like Entelo and other firms in your space, to figure out what is it about this particular job in this particular organization that is unique, and what makes certain kinds of people more or less successful for that specific job. So it's an unsolved problem, but I'm optimistic.
Yeah, and it's great to see a bunch of companies working on it right now, coming at it from different angles, because I'm not sure there'll be a company that solves it, but I think all of us are contributing to the body of innovation. Well, outside of Google, the obvious. What are other companies that you have seen that you think are doing a good job with being mindful, being effective, being informed about their hiring process? Who are some of the other companies that you would point to and say, these guys are doing an interesting job?
Well, there's a company called Bridgewater Associates, which is a big hedge fund, really well known, very idiosyncratic culture, and really fascinating founder, Ray Dalio, who's a friend. They have an incredibly rigorous hiring process. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the best in every dimension, but it's very well thought out, very thoughtful. They're very clear what they're looking for, and they screen like crazy for it. It's also very time intensive. So that's the best I can think of, but I have not done a lot of interviewing myself for jobs, so don't have a real deep perspective.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too to think about where Bridgewater's a relatively small company by headcount, but are there? I'll say it with a little bit of a pun because it's the book that Ray wrote, right? Principles that you can apply from Bridgewater to say a company that might have to hire thousands of people a year. I mean, at Google, one of the things that you guys were really good at was applying data science and machine learning. But you also were the beneficiaries of having a lot of engineers who could work on those problems. Do you see a dynamic where a lot of companies start to do this internally, leveraging their own internal data science teams to help with hiring? Or do you think this is really going to be something more where third parties like your company, our company, others are really going to assist? Or is it too early to tell?
Well, I think it's probably going to be more your company than my company, if that's not too big a hint. No, I think what I found as I've now talking to a lot of large enterprises about their challenges is everybody's got the constraint that I actually had at Google as well, which is you typically don't have your own engineering resources, and every incremental engineer in a large company or small company, they're better spent on whatever the core product is, not on recruiting systems. So I think the problem's going to be solved by somebody in your space, and I'm wildly optimistic. I think outside of the science part of it, though, and the data side, there's simple things people can just start doing. Like, for example, being very clear on the attributes they're looking for in a job. Not the generic job description that gets written, but what do you really want in that person? Then making sure everyone interviews for that, and then having a different person make the hiring decision. Those are kind of sociological things you can do independent of the data that would have a big impact. But I think the data part's going to come from the startup ecosystem.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that is the right thing. Well, what do you think is the thing that most needs to be fixed or improved in hiring right now? And again, I wouldn't ask you to tip your hand on what you guys are working on, but if you just look at the ecosystem, the landscape, what's most broken about recruiting?
I think in the recruiting world, bias is the biggest issue. And I don't mean solely around sort of traditional diversity issues, but I also mean, for example, pedigree bias. Did they work at certain companies? Did they get degrees from certain places? We did a 3-year study at Google to actually get Google to move away from that. And it was a hard job. It was a lot of work to actually move the needle there and change the mindsets. So the biggest factor is, put another way, companies focus too much on past performance and not enough on future potential and how they assess and hire. Some of that shows up in indexing on pedigree. Some of it shows up in terms of bias, if you're black, if you're female, if you're gay, what have you. And so getting that out of the system, first of all, is socially the right thing to do and morally, but it also massively expands your candidate pool. So big opportunity.
I think you're right, and I think that everybody wants the best people, but at the same time, I think people lack confidence in their ability to figure out who those best people are. So, if somebody went to Stanford, worked at Google, they're like, well, I might not be confident, but those Google guys are smart, so they must know what they're doing. I'm going to hire this person. And I think as people gain more confidence, either because their internal processes are better or because technology helps them become better, then I think they'll have more confidence to select that person who went to San Jose State instead of Stanford, who might be phenomenal for the role but doesn't have the same pedigree. And hopefully that's a situation where everybody wins.
Yeah, I think so. That's the dream.
Yeah, for sure. Well, last question for you. So, you wrote probably the closest thing to a modern HR and talent management manual. I read Work Rules a while ago, recommended it to basically everybody in my company. If you were going to do another version today, and you added another chapter, what would that chapter be about?
I think if I were to take another pass at it, what's become clear to me over the last year or two is how important culture is. And I wrote a little about culture and it being rooted in mission and transparency and voice. But what's dawned on me over the last couple of years is that culture is incredibly fragile. That building a great culture takes kind of constant nurturing and work. And if you look at Wells Fargo, if you look at Uber, if you look at what's happened politically in our country, it's a really stark lesson in that a small change in behavior and leadership, for example, can completely transform the norms in a country. One example is The behavior of border guards in San Diego at the border with Mexico completely changed the day after the election. Suddenly, you had border guards who were the same people as before, telling people who are seeking refugee status, trying to get in the United States, they can't come. There were stories of people having to come back 9, 10, 13 times. And that was just a cultural shift. And so if I were to write it again or write another chapter, it would be really underscoring how fragile culture is and how important it is to maintain it and how pervasive the effects can be from just tiny, tiny changes.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Well, Laszlo, this was a pleasure. We're excited to see what you guys are launching when you guys launch. We're excited to hopefully send more enterprise salespeople your way as we come across them. And I just wish you the best. And thank you for taking the time today to be on the podcast.
That's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.